all verses, I'll forefront the result. Godly wisdom will win every time. So, let's go to the first slide. So, Book of Proverbs was written by King Solomon, a very wise man. The wisest king who has ever lived, I'm sure. He said, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." So, wisdom is a gift that comes from God. It's not something that we can achieve on our own. And to have an understanding of God is the beginning of knowledge. So we can't be equal with God, but we can only have knowledge and understanding if we submit ourselves to God. James 3:17. "But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere." First of all pure, then everything else will follow. Wisdom from above is the true wisdom. So, what are the characteristics? Without God, we cannot have pure wisdom, because pure wisdom comes only from God. And we'll be exploring some of these characteristics and some of the results, good and bad, that happen in the world when we do or don't. Look for wisdom from God. Next slide. So, we didn't coordinate this at all, as far as I'm aware, but Beck read most of this out already. So hopefully my interpretation of it does it justice. I'm going to be going through this part of Corinthians, then another part. So, starting from Corinthians 1, verse 20. "Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe." So, look at the state of our culture. I think we all know what I mean when I say that. We can reflect on our age and our time. But this teaching will apply to any culture, to any society at any time. The modern focus on the self sees a weakened, disconnected, and in some places hedonistic culture. Where does this come from? Well, I think it started when we lessened God in our culture, when less people were going to church, when less people dedicated their lives to the wisdom of God. Church going was as expected once upon a time as it was habitual. It was widespread, an inherent part of our culture. We had less fleshly pursuits, or at least we were less likely to fall into them. So, where is the wise person? People outside this room know, if they properly reflect on themselves, that they yearn for a wiser person, for someone to guide them through their lives. Those of us who have submitted to God understand we need look no further. But it is still tempting to seek the wise person in worldly places, to seek out idols. Of course, we should respect leaders, some of them, and important people in our lives, our wives, our husbands, our mothers, our fathers, but we need to be discerning. If we deify ungodly figures, the wise person, we are submitting ourselves to fools, potentially. Ultimately, human wisdom doesn't amount to very much, as I hopefully displayed at the start. Without God, we will struggle to find truth. In fact, we'll be unable to. So this isn't to assume that in what Paul's saying to the Corinthians, that He's entirely against all human wisdom and knowledge, but that such things shouldn't be used as something to boast about. But that isn't the goal. That's not what we're looking for. Our wisdom and knowledge have some value. After all, we're created by God. But we need to be discerning about human wisdom and knowledge. If it doesn't reflect God, most likely it isn't wisdom. Next slide. So, to what Ben read earlier. Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. This doesn't satisfy those who don't accept the wisdom. I think regardless of whether it mentions Jews or Greeks, I think the point that Paul is making here is that people will look for justification. They too often don't start at submission and then see God's glory. They will, I need some proof. I need some evidence. I need to find this. I need it to earn my respect. Whereas with submission, it automatically has my respect. So, demanding signs, looking for wisdom, how can we find these things? How can we see them before we submit? If we don't want to see them, if we refuse, then we won't see them. Let's think about this practically. 180, 60 years ago, as I said, our society was ordered a bit differently back then, I think. Church-going was much more ingrained. Marriage was vaunted. By we, don't think I mean us, culture at large, easily threw away the wisdom of the past by finding faults in the past. But when those faults manifested, it wasn't that the wisdom itself was wrong, but that the wisdom was not being adhered to. Marriage was always a bad deal, we hear from the culture, because it often went badly. But human marriages are participated in by humans. Marriage itself isn't bad. It's truly wisdom from God. Treating your partner badly is bad. Cheating, being tyrannical, being violent. But these aren't godly things. They're the actions of the fool, of the unwise, the person who isn't following God. So there's an important lesson here. One that I'm sure we will understand. God is God, and we are not. He chose us for a relationship with Him, so we must always strive to be God-like in our actions, to treat each other as God intended, to be faithful to our wives, to our husbands, to give, my apologies, to dedicate ourselves to those we love. I think this is where God is hopelessly misunderstood by those in the culture who have turned away or who aren't interested. When marriage fails and God's children fall well short of the glory of God, this is because humans, not God, have given in to sin. The system, the structure, the institution, there's not actually anything wrong with that. It's all about how well we're following God's teachings. So from Proverbs 3, verse 3, let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck, write them on the tablet of your heart. Next slide. So, Corinthians 1 verse 26. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before Him. It's truly willing to choose the humble. So this reflects that in God's wisdom we all have value, serious value. He doesn't judge us by our worldly status. Our worldly status is irrelevant to God. Paul tells the Corinthians to remember what they were when they were called. It wasn't because they were of high status or because they were better than others. It's because as children of God, they could be a vehicle for Him. We can all be a vehicle for God as His children, a vehicle for His wisdom. A calling to salvation, though, comes with serious responsibility. Don't covet. Show love to your fellow man. Be faithful to your spouse. Take care of your children. Live a holy life unto God. So we need to act in His image, but we need to stay humble. You're not all that fancy. I'm not all that fancy. None of us are. But Jesus will accept anybody. You don't need super intelligence, thankfully. You don't even need to be armed with extensive knowledge. You simply need, and you have Jesus' redemption on your side. You need to trust Jesus to be a proper advocate in order for you to be a proper advocate, that is, to be His ambassadors. We don't have to prove we're good enough for God. Whether we're top of the worldly food chain or bottom, it doesn't matter. We are good enough. Does God care if you're the President of the United States or a first-year undergrad? Of course He doesn't. Does He care how much money you earn? Does He care how well you debate, how fast you can run, how many friends you have, how many likes your Instagram posts get? No, He doesn't. He's chosen us because He loves us, because He wants to see His image in us. Our world is filled with the love of wisdom and status, but often worldly status. We aren't, as Christians, we aren't that impressive to the world, but that's okay. The elite minds, those who run the world, those who tell us we can save the planet by drinking through a paper straw or breaking us into group-based oppressors or the oppressed, those who mock us for believing there is something more than the physical world around us, they treat us with contempt. But that's the way it is. Thanks for that. Verse 30. It is because of Him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is, our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. So, indeed God sees intrinsic value in us as humans. He's provided righteousness for us. We need simply follow Him. We cannot fathom creation in all its glory or the glory of God by our own power, because God is the source of power. But if we trust Him, if we understand His supremacy in power, or that He has it, we need not boast in others or in ourselves. We need simply boast in the glory of the Lord. We hear about the rat race in society. I think that term is usually used by fairly cynical people. People who don't think in terms of godliness, think only in terms of money, status, worldly status. How can I get to the top? How can I get that promotion? This isn't the kind of thing that God wants us to pursue. Or we look at the way the discussion around the referendum devolved. On one side, if you don't vote the way I want you to, then you're a racist, you're a bigot, you're a terrible person. On the other side, it's not going to do anything, but it's also going to do way too much. And these are the people that are vaunted, that are celebrated in our society. They don't even make sense by their own standards a lot of the time. Next slide. So move on to Corinthians chapter 3, verses 18 to 23 here. Do not deceive yourselves. If any of you think you are wise by the standards of this age, you should become fools so that you may become wise. I must say, when I was researching this sermon, that was a very confronting That was a very confronting moment when I read that. I made the horrible discovery probably around 5 years ago that I thought far less highly of my own wisdom at that moment than I had 10 years before. That when I was 15, I thought I knew quite a bit. And yet by the stage that I made this realisation, I was clearly much more wise than I had been when I was 15. I was still well short of finding the Lord at that stage, it's fair to say. I can see Mum smiling. So I was a long way behind. We must become fools from a worldly perspective. We will look like fools to the world, as I said. I had thought that belief was silly, that it didn't make sense. However, with a great deal of introspection and looking at the world, I saw a lack of belief in and a lack of following of God just leads to bad outcomes. That's a good place to start. The world's wisdom does not coincide with God's wisdom. Certainly not in 2023. Maybe you look a little bit silly if you settle down with a partner in your early 20s to the world. Maybe you receive scorn if you value having taken care of your children above your career. Well, we will appear foolish to a world that wants that kind of thing, but not to each other, not to God. Because our standard is different, and we have to accept this. Verse 19, for the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. As it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows that the thoughts of the wise are futile. You only live once. YOLO. What does this lead to? Have as much fun in your youth as you possibly can. Maybe not just your youth. Think only of maximising your worldly experiences. Drink, take drugs, give in to hedonism, become a hedonist. This is what the proponents of YOLO would have you do. So you see the dilemma. We can't hold on to human wisdom and God's wisdom at the same time. This can only lead to sin. It can only lead to the rejection of God. Next slide. So then, no more boasting about human leaders. All things are yours. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours. And you are of Christ, and Christ is of God. It feels at this point that Paul's getting a little bit impatient with the Corinthians. If only they would stop with their silly squabbles about who's the best leader and who worships the correct way. We need to humble ourselves truly to gain wisdom. It isn't about that rat race. It isn't about, I know more than you, you know more than me. Because we're learning from the same book, we're learning from the same being, the same wisdom. Learn to think God's thoughts. He was saying, the wisdom of the world is folly. We see this everywhere. Dictatorships demand that you respect or agree with or even worship their leaders. They force you to do it. I think the most charitable reading of that kind of behaviour is that they desire to receive what they inherently understand humans desire to give, to worship. But no human should be worshipped. The wisdom of God is different. He deserves our worship. So don't boast in him. Not all leaders that are deified do it through force, sometimes coercion. I'm from the government and I'm here to help, they say. We saw this during COVID. Everyone. Here's an issue. And yes, everyone. I don't want to be misconstrued. But here came governments to say exactly what the problem was and exactly how to fix it. They made many of us think, well, they're keeping the same. Follow the science, they said. Not the thousands of scientists who disagree with the particular position that they happen to take, but just the ones they chose, just the ones who are saying exactly what they wanted them to say. The lunacy of being told by a mere mortal that they can save you from, in their own words, an uncontrollable and uncontainable virus can only really be comprehended. How can you say the entire world is in danger from an uncontainable force, but just listen to me and I'll contain it for you? But we all want to feel safe. So many of us believe that. Many of us ignored or forgot about our faith in God, or in some cases realised they were lacking that. God's in control, not humans. So trust in God, not in the fool. Mum told me a couple of days ago at work that a customer was less than becoming. And Mum didn't like it. And then the customer didn't like Mum's response and said a horrible thing to her. And I know it upset her. I would offer you the comfort, Mum, that that man was a fool. And you needn't think or worry about it anymore. So in Corinth, the people were talking about the traditions they came from and trying to establish hierarchies around this. Paul said, no, this is a worldly attitude, we don't need it. Don't worry about where you got your knowledge and being superior to each other, because it is the same knowledge. It's God's knowledge, God's wisdom. Trust in that, not the person who told you about it. His wisdom is perfect. We in the world can look at natural world order and make some scientific observations, but we can't understand the depth and majesty of the Almighty Creator. Next slide. Moving on to Romans 1, verses 18 to 23. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. It gets very comforting, in my opinion, at this point. We're not actually called to jump into the darkness with this blind leap. God's glory is everywhere. While we can't fathom him in all his glory, because our minds are simply not big enough to understand his entire plan, he still shows us, he spells it out for us. The content of the gospel is reasonable and rational by our own standards, by what our own human minds can comprehend. So because what can be known about God, what can be known about God is plain, as he has shown it to us. We know that acting in the image of God leads to human prosperity. Many try to push him away with ungodly things to replace his glory. But when we let God in, he says, let there be light, and everything else gets cleared away. Next slide. I forgot about that picture. Galatians 4:8. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. We all desire the Kepta, We all have a desire for a leader, a father, a daddy. We have this desire now. But if we don't understand where it comes from a desire, a link, the fact that we were created by God. That's where it comes from. If we don't understand this, we will look for it in false places. Sometimes we'll find it. The best we can do when we worship these fake idols is to find worldly knowledge. And this inevitably sees us fall short of the glory of God. And it's easy to be led astray. Then there are those who might warp our way of thinking. We all know the types: politicians, podcasters, those people, YouTubers, lecturers at university. This isn't to say these people very crucial bit that's coming now. This isn't to say these people have nothing of value to say, or that they're not capable of guidance or simply of good advice, but it is to say when we value the words of worldly beings as if they were prophets, it's very easy to be led astray. I wonder what this person thinks about this thing, because I trust them in other areas. They're the first person I go to. That's an attitude that I think we should all fight against, myself very much included. So, then there are the ones that actively lead us away from God. There's a certain brand of modern intellectualism that tells us belief is stupid. There are commentators who tell us politics comes above all else, and that we have no time for religion, and that's just a waste of time. Then there are those with outsized worldly power. As Costa mentioned, we see what's going on across the world, be it in Eastern Europe or the Middle East. In one case, it's a certain brand of atheism that informed one situation, or at least was the original context for it. And in another case, it's a certain brand of fundamentalism that informs it. In both cases, the wisdom of God is absent, and the foolishness of man has seen much evil conducted. Psalm 97 verse 10 says, "Hate evil, you who love the Lord, who preserves the souls of his godly ones. He delivers them from the land of the wicked." Next slide. I found these to be too much for me to try to interpret on my own. So I thought it was best to close out the sermon with these simply by reading them. Proverbs chapter 2, 1 to 6. "My son, if you accept my words and store up my commands with you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding. Indeed, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding." On with the prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us all together today to bring all our different experiences, our different understandings, but our same love for you, for your guidance, for your wisdom. I pray that you look over the souls of those who are doing it tough across the world. That you protect them, that you protect their families, their loved ones, and that there can be a finish or a stop to all the evil that's going on as soon as possible. I know, we all know that you're in control. and you'll see to it that the right thing is done. Thank you, God. Amen.